I funded the renovation of my grandparents' farmhouse entirely on my own. A $310,000 restoration I'd been quietly planning for 3 years. When I finally drove out to surprise them on their 45th anniversary, my grandmother was sitting on the front steps in her housecoat at noon, and my grandfather, a man who had spent his entire life solving his own problems in silence, had left me a voicemail that said only, "Morgan, please get here when you can. Something's happening." My aunt's car was already in the gravel lot. So was a van I didn't recognize, backed up to the side entrance with the doors open. My name is Morgan. I'm 34. I work in healthcare compliance auditing, which means I spend my professional life reading the language institutions use when they want to appear generous while protecting their interests. I know which provisions hold and which ones dissolve the moment someone with a financial motive starts asking questions. I didn't come to this work by accident. My grandfather was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's when I was 21. My grandmother absorbed the change like soil takes rain, completely without drama, without announcing it to anyone. She reconfigured their entire life around his needs over the course of about 6 months. She learned to manage his medication schedule with the precision of a pharmacist. She tracked the progression, researched every new treatment option, and laughed at every joke he still managed to make with shaking hands. Neither of them ever asked anyone for help. That was simply who they were. So I decided to give it without being asked. The farmhouse had been in the family for 40 years but had never been properly winterized, never made accessible, never updated past the early 1980s. When I found the right contractor, someone I'd known professionally for years and trusted, I didn't tell anyone. Not my parents. Not my Aunt Delia, who is 5 years older than me and has always occupied the space in our family where competence should be without providing much of the actual substance. I drew up the scope myself, pulled the permits personally, and oversaw every phase. Wide doorways. A zero-threshold shower. Grab bars designed to look like brushed brass towel rails. A kitchen counter section lowered to accommodate my grandfather's reach on days when the tremors were bad. A wraparound porch so he could always find a chair in the sun without stairs. Total cost, $310,000. I financed it myself, including prepaid property taxes for 10 years and a household account. I placed the deed into an irrevocable trust naming my grandparents as sole lifetime beneficiaries. Then I arranged the surprise. I told them I was taking them to a nice dinner for their anniversary. I drove them an hour and a half into the hill country instead, down a road they hadn't been on in years. When they recognized the farmhouse, restored, lit up, completely transformed, my grandmother pressed both hands against the truck window and made a sound I will never forget. My grandfather asked me twice if this was real. Then he got out of the truck and walked up the porch steps without his cane, stood at the railing and looked out over the yard for a very long time. "I thought this place was finished," he finally said. "I thought we were going to have to let it go." "It's not going anywhere," I told him. "Your names are in the trust. Nobody can sell it. Nobody can change how it's used. It's yours for as long as you want it." We spent that first weekend eating on the porch and watching the light move across the hills. I helped him figure out the shower hardware. My grandmother reorganized every cabinet twice. On Sunday, I drove back to the city feeling something settle inside me that had been restless for years. I should have known it wouldn't stay quiet for long. My grandmother, who has never been able to hold happiness inside herself when she's truly feeling it, mentioned the farmhouse to Delia during a phone call 3 days later. Delia asked for the address. My grandmother called me that evening, her voice doing the thing it does when she's trying to hold two feelings apart. "Delia wants to come see it this weekend. Her and Marcus and the kids. Just for the day." She paused. "I wanted to check with you first." That pause told me everything. I had a filing deadline and a client dispute I couldn't hand off, so I didn't drive out that Saturday. I told myself Delia was curious, not calculating. I told myself the legal structure was airtight. I was wrong on the second point, and deliberately naive on the first. My grandfather's voicemail arrived Monday morning while I was in a review meeting. I stepped into the hallway to listen to it twice. His voice was measured in the way it gets when he is very carefully not alarming anyone. "Morgan, I need you to come when you can. Marcus has been making some calls about the property. There's a folder on the kitchen table I don't recognize. I don't fully understand what's being proposed, and I didn't agree to any of it. I was in my car within the hour. I knew something had shifted before I reached the driveway." Marcus's truck was pulled up close to the side entrance. Through the windshield I watched him walk the length of the porch heel to toe, counting under his breath, phone raised to photograph the exterior. He didn't hear me park. Inside, my grandmother was standing at the kitchen window with the look she wears when she's carrying more than she should have to. My grandfather was at the table in front of an open manila folder. Delia was in the sitting room rearranging the bookshelf as though she'd lived there for years. Finally, she said with the warm, slightly wounded smile I'd grown up watching, "We've been trying to reach you." I set down my bag. "What is in that folder?" She told me Marcus had run numbers on short-term rental income. Conservative projections of $30,000 to $40,000 per season, a management company that would handle everything, our grandparents welcome whenever the property wasn't booked. The back door opened, and Marcus came in from the porch, already carrying the room the way people do when they've decided the conversation is settled. He dropped a printed page on the table. "Rental projection. I've already talked to 2 platforms. We could have a live listing by the end of the week." I looked at the document. Then I looked at him. "You've already listed it. Draft listing. Preliminary." He sat down the way you sit in your own home. "Look, you put in serious work here. Nobody's trying to cut you out. We're talking about maximizing an underused asset." "It's not an asset," I said. "It's their home." My grandmother came to stand beside my grandfather and put her hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. I took one slow breath, then went to my car and retrieved my work bag. I have a habit that my colleagues understand and people like Marcus tend to underestimate. Every significant transaction I'm involved in receives the same documentation treatment, regardless of whether it's personal or professional. I had brought the full file. I placed the first document on the table. The deed recorded with the county 9 months ago, held in an irrevocable trust with my grandparents as sole lifetime beneficiaries. I read the relevant clause aloud. The trust instrument granted them exclusive and unconditional right of occupancy, with no provision for subletting short-term rental or commercial use of any kind without written consent from the trustee. "And you're the trustee," Delia said. "I am. My obligation is to ensure the property is used according to its terms. Those terms exist to protect them." Marcus leaned back. Trust language can always be challenged. I placed the second document in front of him. A written legal opinion from an estate attorney confirming the trust structure was valid, properly recorded, and not subject to challenge by non-beneficiaries. "Non-beneficiaries," I said, "means everyone in this room except the 2 of them." The kitchen was very quiet. I placed a third document on the table. A screenshot of the draft rental listing Marcus had uploaded that morning, with photographs taken from our grandparents' front porch. The platform account was registered to his business address. I had submitted a fraud report to the platform's compliance team 2 hours earlier, citing misrepresentation of ownership. Then a fourth document, the county ordinance governing short-term rentals in this jurisdiction. Special use permit required. Health inspection required. No permit on file for this address because no application had ever been filed. Violation fines up to $7,500 per instance. And finally a cease and desist addressed jointly to Delia and Marcus, formally notifying them that any further attempt to list, market, photograph for commercial use, or misrepresent the property would be treated as tortious interference with the trust. Marcus stared at the documents. The warmth had gone out of his face entirely. "We're family," he said. "You're guests," I said. "And at this point, guests who have overstayed. I need you both to leave. You're welcome to come back when you've been invited by the people whose names are in the deed." What followed was loud and not graceful. Marcus made calls in the driveway. Delia spent a long time in the bathroom. Their kids, confused and bored, sat on the porch steps. Eventually both vehicles left. My grandmother made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floor. The first weekend they visited, she said after a while, Marcus walked every inch of the property. He asked about the well output. He asked about the roof warranty. She wrapped her hands around her mug. I thought he was just interested. I should have called you. My grandfather came in from the porch and stood in the doorway. He asked about converting the barn, he said. I told him it wasn't my decision. He paused. It is my decision, actually. And I don't want to convert the barn. The posts went up 4 days later. Marcus first, then Delia sharing. Carefully worded commentary about generosity as a form of control. Nothing named. Everything implied. A distant cousin sent me a message. 2 of my grandmother's friends texted her with worried questions. I wrote one response. An email to both of them, with my firm's senior compliance officer copied, noting that any verifiable public statements referencing me, my grandparents, or the property would be addressed as defamation if materially false, and as tortious interference if they caused demonstrable harm to any protected interest under the trust. All future communication was to be directed through my office. The posts disappeared within 48 hours. 3 weeks later, my grandfather called on a Tuesday. There was a man on the porch, he said, holding a folder. Said he had a signed rental agreement. I told him to go inside and lock the door. I pulled up the property camera on my work computer. I'd had a system installed during the renovation, motion activated, feeding to an app on my phone, and called the county non-emergency line. Then I texted Marcus a still from the camera feed. I am watching this in real time. The trust is on file with the county and with local law enforcement. I suggest your contact leave before the deputy arrives. His reply took 3 minutes. Wrong address. Our mistake. Sorry. The car was gone before the deputy reached the road. That weekend I drove out with a locksmith and replaced all the entry hardware with keypad deadbolts. When I tested the system, my grandfather stood beside me watching the camera feeds cycle through on the kitchen tablet. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What? How long I spent trying to take up as little space as possible. Not asking for too much. Making myself manageable. He was quiet for a moment. It never once occurred to me that I was allowed to say this is mine. This is not available. You don't get to touch this. You're allowed, I said. He smiled, the unguarded version I remembered from years ago. I know that now. Delia hasn't called. The door isn't locked from my side, but I'm not standing at it waiting. Marcus sent a short email 6 weeks after the driveway incident with a subject line that read, "Moving forward," 2 sentences acknowledging he'd handled things poorly. A request to revisit the conversation eventually. I read it once, moved it to a folder, and haven't replied. What I understand now is something I spent a long time getting wrong. I believed that caring for people meant absorbing their needs indefinitely. That if you named a limit, you were the one who had broken something. What I know now is that a limit isn't a rupture. It's what keeps the structure sound. I didn't restore that farmhouse to own anything, or to hold anything over anyone. I restored it because I could see clearly what my grandparents had earned, and I wanted to make it real. A place where my grandfather watches the light change over the hills without having to manage anyone else's reaction to his tremors. A place my grandmother can rearrange at her own pace with no one measuring the square footage. Have you ever given something completely time, money, effort, and then had to stand between it and the people who wanted to repurpose it? If so, you already understand that protecting what you built is not the same as withholding love. Sometimes it's the only way to make sure the love actually lands.